bonjour. Je vous remercie pour votre fidélité et ça nous fait chaud au cœur de vous voir si nombreux, sachant qu'il y a encore quelques-uns qui n'ont pas pu obtenir de place, mais qui pourront suivre sur Internet la diffusion de ces entretiens, de ces échanges. Donc, depuis quelques semaines, il y a un livre, un seul livre, qui retient toute notre attention. Il s'agit d'une colère noire qui vient de paraître aux éditions Autrement. Son auteur est aujourd'hui avec nous. Ta-Nehisi Coates, bonjour. Je vous remercie d'avoir accepté notre invitation. Alors je tiens tout d'abord à vous dire combien je suis heureuse, mais aussi émue, de vous accueillir ici, au musée Dapper. Car ce livre, cet essai, je ne sais pas trop comment il faut l'appeler, mais on verra un petit peu plus tard. Ce livre m'a énormément touchée, ce d'autant plus que j'y ai retrouvé des interrogations, les miennes, mais aussi celles de ma génération, parce que, je ne dirais pas le nombre d'années, parce que j'avouerai l'âge, alors je n'ai pas envie. Il y a quelques nombreuses années, nous nous posions des questions sur notre identité, sur notre place aussi. Nous, les afro-descendants peut-être, terme que l'on reprend aujourd'hui. Et je crois que ces grandes voix que vous évoquez, porte-parole, écrivain, James Baldwin, Richard Wright, Malcolm X, nous ont aidés dans notre réflexion, mais aussi dans notre prise de conscience. Et je sais que dans la salle, il y a des comédiens, il y a des écrivains, des auteurs aussi qui ont été nourris par ces textes-là. Alors, merci à vous de les faire revivre et aussi de les faire découvrir à toute une génération qui n'a peut-être pas connaissance des noms, des idées, qui nous ont aidés aussi à avancer, qui nous ont fait mûrir. Je souhaite aussi vous dire que le lieu où vous vous trouvez ici, le musée Dapper, notre espace, a pour vocation, c'est une grande vocation que nous essayons de maintenir depuis 30 ans, qui est de porter les cultures du monde noir. Alors même si ce mot noir est compliqué pour nous, on va l'utiliser par commodité, mais c'est notre engagement. Et je crois que votre engagement, vos engagements, que ce soit chez vous, mais c'est un exemple pour nous et pour ça, je vous en remercie. Je vais laisser la parole à Valérie Marin-Lamellé qui va conduire ces échanges avec vous. Valérie, vous êtes écrivain, journaliste au point et puis critique littéraire. Et je vous remercie vraiment parce que vous avez travaillé énormément pour que nous puissions découvrir l'univers de Ta-Nehisi Coates. Et je vous souhaite à tous une très très bonne après-midi.
Eh bien, bonjour, Ta-Nehisi Coates. Donc, on l'a compris, votre livre « Between the World and Me » est sorti en juillet aux États-Unis et plus personne n'ignore que Barack Obama l'a emporté en vacances, que Toni Morrison le salue comme un classique, le New York Times le juge aussi essentiel que l'eau ou l'air. Donc, ce sont quelques indices de la réception américaine de ce livre qui nous arrive donc dans sa traduction française par Thomas Chaumont, avec une préface d'Alain Maboncou aux éditions Autrement, sous le titre « Une colère noire ». Vous êtes installé depuis le mois d'août dernier pour 1 an à Paris, où vous apprenez le français chaque matin, et vous le parlez très bien, mais vous avez préféré que cet entretien se déroule avec nos traductrices qui sont en cabine. Et là, vous revenez tout juste d'un aller-retour aux États-Unis. Et je voulais vous demander simplement si vous étiez aussi et toujours aussi sollicité pour ce livre aux États-Unis, d'où vous revenez. Comment ça se passe là-bas pour vous?
It's been incredible. The reception. Well, I guess I should start at the beginning. And j'essaie parler un peu. Oui, Nicolas. Mon ami Nicolas, il m'a dit vous parlez trop vite. Donc, I'm going to try to talk really, really slowly. I was telling Valerie that when I started, you only have the perspective of a writer. And the perspective of the writer is to get the thing done. I'm very happy to see all of you guys here. But as anybody, my family and my friends can testify, a year and a half ago, when I was really in the mix of actually making this thing happen, I was scared it wasn't going to get published. So the fact that you have, or that some of you have, a book in your hand, a book in French, no less. I'm not sure how that happened. And so it's like somewhat difficult for me to process everything, the reception in America, much less the reception here. I don't even know what to say anymore. I need like a month or probably a couple years without the book, without Between the World and Me, to really understand what's going on.
Bon, merci Ta-Nehisi. Quelques mots pour vous situer. Donc vous êtes né à Baltimore en 1975, dans l'État du Maryland, au nord-ouest des États-Unis, pour ceux qui ne repèrent pas tout à fait. Vous êtes journaliste pour le prestigieux mensuel The Atlantic, et votre blog fait partie des 25 meilleurs au monde selon le classement de Time Magazine. Et vous êtes l'auteur de 3 livres. Mais vous avez quand même bien fait paraître un recueil de poèmes en 1990, et je voudrais savoir pourquoi...
Wow, I forget. That's not a book. That was not a book. You're right.
Mais vous voulez oublier vos poèmes?
Wow. Oh my God. It's embarrassing that you found that. Okay.
Bon, on passe à la question suivante ou... Comme vous voulez, hein, on peut... Hop. Alors, on passe à la question suivante. Donc, voilà, au livre suivant, donc celui que vous revendiquez, The Beautiful Struggle, que vous avez publié en 2008. Mais bien sûr, c'est sans doute votre dernier livre qui vous place en quelque sorte en nouveau penseur de la condition noire, dans un pays où, nous le savons, la violence du racisme continue de frapper. Et là, c'est sous la forme d'une lettre à votre fils de 15 ans que vous démontrez implacablement comment et pourquoi les Noirs ont encore et toujours raison d'avoir peur pour leur corps aux États-Unis aujourd'hui. C'est dire que le mythe du rêve américain en prend un coup. Et vous avez, pour ce livre, choisi l'approche autobiographique, et notre entretien va suivre un peu ce parcours en s'arrêtant sur votre formation intellectuelle que Christiane Falgueret-Levaux évoquait tout à l'heure. Et avant de commencer, je voudrais simplement faire part à ceux qui ne l'ont pas encore lu de la puissance littéraire de ce texte, qui bien évidemment est un des facteurs majeurs de sa réception. Elle fait de vous d'abord un écrivain, récompensé par le National Book Award 2015 aux États-Unis, et sa force bouleversante vous a valu aussi d'être comparée à celle qui se dégage de La prochaine fois le feu de James Baldwin. Je dis aussi une petite chose sur autour de l'écrivain et du journaliste, il y a celui qui a 472 000 followers sur Twitter et qui, pour donner un exemple, sur votre article sur The Case of Reparations, un des essais de votre blog, il a été partagé plus de 240 000 fois sur les médias sociaux. Donc voilà. Alors pour ce livre et pour sa tonalité littéraire, je souhaitais qu'on en donne tout de suite, si je puis dire, la couleur, avec l'extrait que nous avons retenu pour que vous puissiez nous faire entendre la langue, l'anglais, puis je le lirai ensuite en français. Et ce passage de votre livre, c'est ce soir où votre fils apprend la relaxe du policier qui a abattu Michael Brown, 18 ans, le 9 août 2014, de 6 coups de feu. Donc, si vous voulez lire cet extrait, Ta-Nehisi.
So just 2 quick words about this. As Valerie explained, it's about me trying to talk to my son about when Michael Brown was a young man in the United States who was killed by a police officer, and the decision came down to not prosecute the police officer. One of the hard things about my life, and yet one of the benefits about my life I've found, is the people around me who I loved, who loved me, who were older than me, who were mentors to me, my professors, my father, my mother. They never tried to hide the world from me. There was always this message that the world is as it is, and you have to figure out how to live in it and what your life is going to be about within it. And the fact of the matter was that when this killing happened, I really didn't have much else to say to my son besides what had been said to me. And that's what I offer you here now. You stayed up till 11 p.m. that night, waiting for the announcement of an indictment. And when instead it was announced that there was none, you said, "I've got to go." And you went into your room and I heard you crying. I came in 5 minutes after, and I didn't hug you, and I didn't comfort you, because I thought that it would be wrong to comfort you. I did not tell you that it would be okay, because I have never believed it would be okay. What I told you is what your grandparents tried to tell me, that this is your country, that this is your world, that this is your body, and you must find some way to live within the all of it. I tell you now that the question of how one should live within a black body, within a country lost in the dream, is the question of my life, and the pursuit of this question I have found ultimately answers itself.
Tu es resté debout jusqu'à 23 heures ce soir-là en attendant la nouvelle d'une condamnation. Et lorsqu'on a annoncé qu'il n'y aurait aucune condamnation, tu as dit « faut que j'y aille ». Tu es allé te réfugier dans ta chambre et je t'ai entendu pleurer. Je suis venue te voir 5 minutes plus tard, mais je ne t'ai pas pris dans mes bras. Je ne t'ai pas consolé parce que je pensais que te consoler était une mauvaise idée. Je ne t'ai pas dit que tout se passerait bien parce que je n'ai jamais cru que les choses se passeraient bien. Ce que je t'ai dit, c'est que tes grands-parents avaient toujours essayé de me dire « Ceci est ton pays, ton monde, ton corps, et tu dois trouver une manière, quelle qu'elle soit, d'y vivre, de vivre avec. » Je te le dis, cette question « Comment vivre avec un corps noir dans un pays perdu dans le rêve ?» est la question de toute ma vie, et cette quête, je l'ai compris, trouve au bout du compte sa réponse en elle-même. Voilà, donc ce moment dans la vie de votre fils de 14 ans, je pense à l'époque, Ta-Nehisi Coates, vous ramène cruellement au moment où vous apprenez la mort par une bavure policière en 2000 de votre ami Prince Jones, et que l'on va voir là justement au centre de ce montage, et avec Michael Brown aussi. Et là, cet ami, cet étudiant avec lequel vous étiez à Howard University, ce lieu où toute l'élite noire est passée, c'est en quelque sorte comme un rappel de cette violence, de cette douleur, et surtout le constat que la peur est intacte. Et cette peur, vous la décrivez dans votre enfance, et ce sera encore un tout petit extrait de votre livre, cette fois traduit simultanément pour le public anglophone. Être noir dans le Baltimore de ma jeunesse, c'était comme être nu face aux éléments, face aux armes à feu, face aux coups de poing, aux couteaux, au crack, au viol et à la maladie. Cette nudité n'a rien d'une erreur, rien de pathologique. Elle n'est que le résultat logique et volontaire d'une politique, la conséquence prévisible de ces siècles passés à vivre dans la peur. À l'époque de l'esclavage, la loi ne nous protégeait pas. Aujourd'hui, à ton époque, la loi est devenue une excuse pour pouvoir t'arrêter et te fouiller. Autrement dit, elle n'est que le prolongement de cette agression physique. Mais une société qui en protège certains par un filet invisible d'écoles, d'emprunts immobiliers subventionnés, de richesses accumulées, et ne consent à t'offrir que la protection d'une justice criminelle, cette société-là a échoué dans la mise en pratique de ses bonnes intentions, à moins qu'elle n'ait réussi à imposer quelque chose de bien plus sombre. Quel que soit le nom qu'on donne à ce système, il n'a eu qu'un résultat, notre infirmité face aux forces criminelles à l'œuvre dans ce monde. Que l'agent de ces forces soit blanc ou noir n'a aucune importance. Ce qui en a en revanche, c'est notre condition, c'est le système qui fait de ton corps un objet destructible. Alors j'ai 2 questions en réaction à ce passage. La première, c'est être noir, comme vous le décrivez là dans votre enfance à Baltimore. Est-ce que cela fait de toute façon de soi quelqu'un d'à part, quelqu'un de différent, quel que soit le lieu et le milieu aux États-Unis?
Désolé. Ça, c'est un peu complexe.
Bon, mesdames, traduction en anglais.
Yeah, The thing is, in America, it's not, I try to distinguish in the book between race and racism, okay? So the question is, to be black, is that the problem? But the fact of the matter is, the very question, I think it's really important to get into it this way, the very question, to be black, is a result of decisions that were made a long time ago. It's not having dark skin that makes you different wherever you go in the United States. The history of the interaction between people with darker skin and lighter skin, the history of the interaction between people with curlier hair and straighter hair, the history of the interaction between people with brown eyes and blue eyes or gray eyes or green eyes is actually quite long. It's a long, long history. What African Americans face in my country, what I would go so far as, the people who we call black face around the world in countries like France, is the result of decisions. It's not natural. So the problem is not necessarily being black. The problem is that the country is founded on the plunder and the extraction of people who happen to have a darker skin, who've been put into a box called black. And yeah, that's a problem wherever you go in the United States, because the entirety of the United States would not exist without that plunder. I need to be very, very specific about this. This is true from an economic perspective. At the onset of the Civil War, as I say in the book, 60% of the exports that came out of the United States came from cotton. In other words, they were worked by slave hands. If you went into the southern portion of the United States, you would find several states, for instance, South Carolina, for instance, Mississippi, for instance, Louisiana, where the majority of the people, or half of the people who lived there, were in fact enslaved. There would be no United States without that slave labor. It simply would not exist. And you can follow the political trajectory of the United States up until well into the 20th century, some would argue into the 21st century. And many of the laws that built the United States, for instance, how we built our housing, how we built our social safety net, were only made possible through the exclusion of people who we refer to as black, people who we have talked about as belonging to a black race. They could not exist without that exemption. So yes, that's a problem wherever you go. When I'm in France and I go into the restaurants, the music I hear is American music, often. 70% of the time, it's actually black music. That music is derived from the pain I just described. It's derived from being on the bottom of the policies I just identified for you. And so, imagining America without that is to not imagine America at all. So it's not really possible to go anywhere in the United States and to forget, who you are, or forget what happened. It's always there. It's always in the back of your head. I've been nowhere in America where that was not true.
Et vous parlez alors que l'on célèbre actuellement le mois de l'histoire des Noirs.
Yes. It's I don't know. It's always there. And I think I'm uncomfortable even saying it's ours. It's the story of being black per se, because I think I don't want to lose sight of the power aspect of it. It has to that's the thing. It's a done thing. It's not a matter of having darker skin. I know that as black people, that's one way in which we rally ourselves. But I suspect that were I somebody else, I could have written this book from a Native American perspective, for instance. Were I somebody else, I certainly could have written this from a woman's perspective, for instance. I am talking about the specific instance of being black in America, and I'm talking about the specific instance, because of who I am, of being a black male in America, who's the father of a black male son. But this is a book that's ultimately about power. And so it's not just bound up, into the story of folks that we call black, even if that's, what it ultimately is.
Et d'ailleurs, on le sent dans les descriptions que vous faites de votre enfance, où cette peur était là, et cette peur, elle est humaine, tout simplement, sauf que vous en décrivez évidemment le contexte particulier. De quoi aviez-vous peur et de qui?
So I guess I'll say two things. And this is difficult given the title of the book, but I will go ahead and say it anyway. When people think of black people in America, the image, like there are two emotions that really, when you talk about race and racism in America that come up. White people are afraid, and black people are angry. And that undergirds the entire relationship between people we refer to as racially white and people we refer to as racially black. And white people are afraid of black anger. And that's like the dynamic. And you can see that in the laws, around slavery. You can see that there's always this fear of what are these black people going to do with us. But in fact, that very construct is rooted in the perspective of the conqueror. Because the fact of the matter is when you look at the scoreboard, it's quite clear who has more to be afraid of and who does not. Some of us might wish it to be otherwise, but there simply is no long history of revenge among black people. That doesn't exist. There is a long history of either direct, white violence towards black people or indirect white violence towards black people. I grew up in an era of indirect violence, which is to say, I lived in neighborhoods that were quite violent. And often the people who inflicted that violence were people who looked like me. It took a long time before I became, truly aware of the kind of violence that the police could do. And even when I did, it was mostly distant. The day-to-day violence that I had to deal with, that my son has to deal with, that most black people have to deal with, is the violence that comes from people who look like you. But is it, in fact, violence from people who look like you? Because the fact of the matter is when you look at the history of the neighborhood I lived in, it had been subject to certain housing laws. The neighborhood itself had been formed by racism. There was no imagining the neighborhood without racism. At the beginning of the 20th century, Baltimore attempted to literally zone neighborhoods by race. My grandmother couldn't live certain places because she was black. My mother had to be raised certain places because she was black. My father in Philadelphia, it was the same thing. So by the time I was born in 1975, there were things that were hardwired. Black people lived someplace and were only allowed to live someplace, and white people lived other places. And if you compare those two places, in general, the places where black people lived had less resources. What happens when you have a group of people, by the time I was born, with a 300-year history of being plundered by another group of people? You restrict them to a certain neighborhood. You don't allow them to go beyond that neighborhood. That neighborhood has less resources than other neighborhoods. That neighborhood is still being daily plundered. What then happens? So there was a lot to be afraid of. Anytime you are living in a situation in which, somebody has their foot on your neck, even if the foot is not, the visible thing you see, you are afraid. You are afraid. My Baltimore was a very, very violent place. My New York today is still a very, very, very violent place. And the fragility of my life, of my body, was always apparent to me when I walked out the door. It was just always there, even if, as a young person, I could not understand why that was so.
Est-ce que vous étiez seul à ressentir cette peur, ou est-ce que vous pouviez la partager, et avec qui?
Yeah, it's I don't. You always feel it. I think as a young person, you feel it a lot more directly because you have less power. So, as I say in the book, when I was 12, 11 years old, every single decision I made during the course of a normal day was in reaction to some sort of fear, or the majority of the decisions. On an ordinary school day for me, I had to think about how I dressed. But I did not think about how I dressed the way normal American kids think about how they dress. I had to think about what it said about me. I had to think about an image I was trying to project to other people, and the image was I was not somebody to be messed with. That was an image I had to project. I had to think about who I was walking down the street with. I had to think about how many people I was walking down the street with. When I was in class, I had to worry about who was looking at me and how they were looking at me. At lunch, I had to think about who I was sitting with. After school, I had to decide which route I thought I should take and why that would be, better. And all of these decisions were about preventing somebody from doing something to me. It was always there, and it was so direct. As an adult, it's fine. As an adult, obviously, it's a different kind of fear. But you have something else, If you're a parent like me, you look at your child, and you see a child going through that. And there's no real escape from it, And if you're like me, you might be in partnership with a black woman who has her own stories of fear that are similar and yet, a little bit different. And you are carrying with you all of your parents' fears and all of your grandparents' fears. And so, in many ways, it's not as bad because you have control over the fear, you have control over the things you fear. But then at the same time, you have those who are most precious to you, who you have now, grown old enough to really, really appreciate. And they're subject to it. And there is nothing you can do about it. And that's the sort of reality that in some way all parents have to come to terms with, but really black parents in a very, very specific way have to come to terms with.
Oui, on comprend très bien ça en vous lisant. On comprend aussi comment la peur se transforme en rage, comment les rituels de combat sont une manière de la dépasser, de se protéger de sa propre peur, de s'armer. Et ça, c'est aussi un sujet, j'allais dire, universel. Et ce que vous écrivez, ça concerne aussi au-delà des Afro-Américains, ça concerne les violences dans les banlieues, ça concerne le comportement d'autoprotection comme ça. Si quelqu'un peut nous protéger des bruits de son portable, ce serait tout à fait agréable. Et cela dit, par rapport à votre enfance, il y a quelque chose dont vous venez de parler sur les parents, les grands-parents, etc. Et il faut quand même dire que vous avez eu, par rapport à bien d'autres, la chance de grandir non pas dans un milieu qui roulait sur l'or, mais qui du moins était particulièrement conscientisé, puisque en effet votre père Paul Coates a fait partie du mouvement des Black Panthers, et vous racontez, je crois ne l'ayant pas lu, mais cette beautiful struggle paternelle dans votre précédent livre, et je voudrais savoir en quoi vous vous sentez héritier de cette lutte politique pour la condition des Noirs aux États-Unis.
I think Between the World and Me is a particular book. When I wrote it, I thought a lot about. Well, in America, I think because of the church, because of Christianity, because of religion, there is a tradition of, in African-American literature, of writing these books that at the end of the day make people feel like everything's going to be okay. Even if it's not going to be okay tomorrow, ultimately in your lifetime. And I think it's not always this explicit, but I think this is the message. Ultimately, God will work it out. I was raised in a household where there really wasn't a God. I was raised in absence of that. My dad were here today. If he were here, he would tell you that, he's, I guess, agnostic or something. But there was not a heavy Christian influence in my life. And so that created a kind of absence, what I guess people ordinarily call hope, which I think is deeply tied to, Christian notions of justice. I didn't have those in my life. They just weren't around. I did not have them to make sense of the world. And so what do you grab on when you don't have that? What if tomorrow is not going to be okay? What if we ultimately do lose this struggle? What if there is no, necessarily, any sort of promise that there will be an America without white supremacy? Well, what we had in my house was the struggle. The struggle meant something. What it meant was that there was some particular beauty, some principle in getting up every day and doing the right thing. And not doing the right thing because you necessarily thought you could win, but doing the right thing because you wanted to be able to look yourself in the mirror at the end of the day. And that, I hesitate to use the term spiritual, but that's the best thing I have right now. I just can't, it gives a kind of, don't know, I guess it's almost a religious feeling in and of itself, a spiritual feeling. I have no other way to describe it. But like, I think ultimately none of us can say what happens tomorrow. I don't think anybody can say that, you know? I just completely disbelieve in that. But what I can say is that, you know, should the world go over the ledge, should everything fall apart, should America descend into anarchy, should, you know, global warming wipe all of us out, you know, I can say I was not part of the group of people who was trying to push the world over the cliff. That I was one of the people that tried to prevent it. That's the struggle. That's the importance of the struggle. You know, I mean, you know, I guess my hopes and my ambitions are relatively small. You know, and in this, you know, I'm pulling a little bit from James Baldwin. I hope to be a really good writer, and I hope to be a good human being. And ultimately, that's what the struggle is about. You know, did you get up every day and, you know, do everything? You know, this book, as you know, has been said, it's a letter to my son. Can I tell my son, in this world, knowing the weight of white supremacy, knowing that he lives in a country that was founded on the destruction of people who looked like him, can I look him in the face and say, you know what, everything's going to be all right. You know what, you're going to win. I mean, is that a truthful statement? Is that one that's rooted in the evidence? Is that, in fact, even a loving statement? These are the sort of questions that, you know, I really tried to raise in the book. And I concluded that I could not. But what I can say and what I can urge is for you to get up every day and struggle. And not struggle because you think you're ultimately going to win, but struggle because that's what people before you did. And what little bit that you've gained, what little prominence you have, what advantages you have is ultimately rooted in that. It's what other people did before you. You know, and in addition to that, just you know, the basic problem of keeping your own conscience, which I think is really, really important. So that was the principle that you know, I tried to give in the book.
Mais les luttes, elles ont existé avant celles que vous menez vous, avant celles que vous conseillez à votre fils. Donc, c'est pour ça que je posais l'héritage, la question de l'héritage, aussi bien du mouvement des Black Panthers, aussi bien de Martin Luther King,
Ouais.
aussi bien de Malcolm X, aussi bien, c'est-à-dire toute cette histoire,
Ouais.
et vous la connaissez par cœur, par votre famille et par toutes les lectures que vous avez eues et que vous n'avez cessé de combler sans arrêt, de lire, d'essayer de comprendre. Donc, ces luttes antérieures, avant vous, qu'est-ce que vous en avez gardé?
Well, when I was a kid, for those of you, I mean, I'm not going to assume everybody here has read the book. Right? My dad was in the Black Panther Party. Malcolm X was, like I said, we didn't really have a God in our house. We didn't really have a Jesus in our house. Malcolm X was about as close as you got to Jesus. And I mean, he was a guy who actually died, right? You know, actually, well, he was killed. You know? So he was Jesus, and he had, you know, he had died for something. He had, in fact, died for a principle that was very, very important, and that was the idea that, you know, Malcolm would give these lectures, and he would talk about the physical features of black people. And he would say, and I don't have this, you know, oh yes I do, I remember. He would say, who taught you to hate your nose? Who taught you to hate your mouth? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin? Who taught you to hate, you know, the curl in your hair? Who taught you to hate yourself? And what he was saying, even though he was talking about, you know, the very, very physical body, this is not about like ascendance. No, this is not about God coming into our lives and making everything okay. This is about our physical features, our bodies. And what he was saying is your physical features are the equal of anybody else's. It sounds like a simple statement, but it's actually quite profound. You know, if you can understand that, like, as I said before, in America, there's this tradition of talking about the heart and the spirit. These things that we, you know, were hard for me to process as a kid, but aren't really seeable. Malcolm is talking about the very, very tangible things, you know, and he's saying that which is tangible is equal, you know, and as simple as that sounds, that was profound. That was profound. It inspired my dad, you know, when he went into the Black Panther Party. It was alive in my house. I got tired of hearing about it. It was too much often. But, in terms of what I took with it, it was, my religion, I mean, to the extent that I had one. Struggle was my religion. And all the people that you mentioned, many of them, they died. They were killed. I mean, they did not get to see, this sort of grand future that they were fighting for. Martin Luther King was shot. And in America, every day, we celebrate his birthday. But like, again, me, with my own beliefs about life, like when I think about that, when I think about the fact that he had to get shot in the head for the same sort of basic rights that Americans enjoy, other Americans enjoy, it's hard for me to take hope from that. Because I believe in the value of life, and his life was lost for, something that other people enjoy all the time. And that is why, ultimately, I keep coming back to this issue of struggle. Struggle. Because, as I say in the book, the individual life of Martin Luther King is important. The very human life of Martin Luther King as a person, not as an icon, but as a dude who came home at night, kissed his wife, hugged his children, and went to sleep, got up in the morning, had breakfast. His individual life was lost. And it was wrong. His murder was wrong. And every day, I don't want to cover that up. And in that sense, to me, like, struggle forces you to confront the monstrosity, the absurdity, of the universe, of our country. I don't want to forget that. That's the biggest thing. Like, when I think about black people, when I think about the black struggle, it's a very, very different message, I think, than a lot of people take. But that, to me, is like the heart of it.
C'est aussi le message de Black Lives Matters?
Probably not. And obviously, I support, Black Lives Matter, but I think that they're much more rooted in the dominant message in the African-American community, the dominant political message in the African-American community of hope. They believe. They should believe. They're activists. Je suis écrivain. It's different. It's very, very, the task of, those who, have to actually get people to do something, and the task of those who, sit back and, try to see the world and speak to it as honestly as they can, it's different. It's a different perspective.
Revenons un petit peu sur cette formation intellectuelle. Votre père vous a donné, puisqu'il était lui-même éditeur de livres sur l'histoire afro-américaine, il vous a donné tout ce dont vous pouviez rêver. Et on va peut-être faire un petit tour comme ça. On a donc l'université de Howard, dont vous décrivez magnifiquement The Yard. Ça, vous retrouvez tout le monde noir. Évidemment Du Bois, évidemment Zora Neale Hurston et Langston Hughes et bien d'autres. Et puis on peut arriver à celui duquel finalement vous venez occuper la place manquante selon Toni Morrison. C'est énorme comme déclaration de sa part, de la part du prix Nobel de littérature. Et voilà, je crois que parmi les textes qui ont vraiment compté pour vous, il y en a un qui est extrait de La prochaine fois le feu. Peut-être c'est le moment de nous le donner en partage, puisque vous l'avez sélectionné pour nous, Ta-Nehisi.
So, James Baldwin is extremely important to me. It's weird because now that I'm here in France, they say, "Did you come to France because of James Baldwin?" It's not why I came to France, but it's why I do everything else, just not the France part. That's the interesting thing. I just a few words about Baldwin before I read from this. I think for a lot of people, Baldwin exists as a political figure. We remember what Baldwin fought for. We remember what Baldwin, with the fronts on which he was active. We think about civil rights. But because of my profession and because of what I do, Baldwin is to me first and foremost a writer. And thus, as far as I'm concerned, he is the preeminent American essayist of the 20th century. When I was writing Between the World and Me, I repeatedly, went back and read this book that I'm about to read from, The Fire Next Time. And I tried to figure out how the hell he did this, which is not easy at all. This is and I hope it comes across in French. I really, really does. Dude, this is a work of just incredible, incredible poetry. It is very, very difficult to look at a situation, a political situation that you are directly involved in, and not get pulled into it, and not become didactic, and not, devolve into sloganeering. But maintain your literary sense, your need to reflect things in all of their beauty and in all of their terribleness. And somehow he did it in here, And so I figured I would give you guys just a little taste of that, because that was really above all what I was trying to do. This is not, telling people to show up for a voter registration drive. This is literature. And that too is important. Baldwin is talking about his time in Harlem as a young man and seeing the changes that overcame people. I would say this is his moment of awareness of the fear that he was surrounded by. For the wages of sin were visible everywhere. In every wine-stained and urine-splashed hallway, in every clanging ambulance bell, in every scar on the face of the pimps and their whores, in every helpless newborn baby being brought into this danger, in every knife and pistol fight on the avenue, and in every disastrous bulletin, a cousin, mother of 6, suddenly gone mad. The children parceled out here and there. An indestructible aunt rewarded for years of hard labor by a slow, agonizing death in a terrible small room. Someone's bright son blown into eternity by his own hand. Another turned robber and carried off to jail. It was a summer of dreadful speculations and discoveries, of which these were not the worst. Crime became real, for example, for the first time, not as a possibility, but as the possibility. One could never defeat one's circumstance by working and saving one's pennies. One would never, by working, acquire that many pennies. And besides, the social treatment accorded even the most successful Negroes proved that one needed, in order to be free, something more than a bank account. One needed a handle, a lever, a means of inspiring fear.
Merci.
Ça, c'est James Baldwin.
Il faut dire aussi que le titre vous vient de Richard Wright. Donc, justement, vous le mettez en exergue, vous mettez une citation en exergue. Et ce titre, peut-être, il faudrait nous l'expliquer aussi. Donc, l'exergue, c'est « Et un matin dans les bois, je trébuchais soudain sur la chose, trébuchais sur elle dans une clairière herbeuse que gardaient chênes et ormes aux écorces pelées, et les détails de la scène se sont levés, plus noirs que la suie, s'interposant entre le monde et moi. » Alors, ce titre, dont nous n'avons pas l'idée dans la traduction française.
Well, yeah, I love that title. Between the World and Me is a poem. First and foremost, a poem written by Richard Wright. And what it attempts to do is it recounts a lynching. But the perspective is very, very important. It's a young man and he's wandering through the woods and he stumbles upon the remains of the lynching, literally the physical destroyed body of a black man. And he observes it, from this kind of distance, trying to figure out what happened. And suddenly, about halfway through the poem, he is in fact pulled back. And he is the man. And he himself is being lynched. And he goes through all of the horrible physical details and how it felt to be lynched. Until at the end of the poem, he is only, the same stony skull that he stumbled upon. There's an element of horror, in the poem, an element of both horror and science fiction. It's almost like, Hitchcockian or something like that. But it's also like something that's very, very important in its aesthetics. It's this idea of being snatched back from into history. Americans, and perhaps to some extent all people, I tend to think it may be somewhat more difficult over here, but perhaps it happens over here too. Americans consider themselves beyond and above history, unless it's history that advantages them. You know, if it's George Washington, yes, that history is important. If it's George Washington's slaves, that's less important. In fact, it's not important at all, and you should stop talking about it. Heritage is important when it makes you bigger than you actually are in America. And again, perhaps that's true everywhere. Perhaps that's true everywhere. But what I really wanted to do, in this book, and what I think is the message of that poem, is how you can't really escape history. And for Black people, it's impossible to view history from a distance, because every time a Michael Brown is killed, every time a Trayvon Martin is killed, every time a Renisha McBride is killed, every time a Jordan Davis is killed, a Prince Jones is killed, we are snatched back into history. The comparisons being constantly made to Emmett Till, for instance, we're pulled back. And that really was one of the big things I wanted to get across to the book, and I guess to the extent to my son, or I've always tried to get across to my son. You can't escape history. You don't have the luxury of regarding it from a distance and saying, look, this is interesting, what happened here? It's not a study for us, it is our lives, and I think that's true, for most people. Some people have the luxury of forgetting it, of losing themselves in a dream, but, black people, and perhaps anybody with a foot on their neck, never has, the luxury of forgetting that.
Mais vous évoquez tout au long de ce livre, justement, la remise en cause nécessaire de ce que vous appelez le rêve, ce mythe américain d'un grand pays qui a tout bon, enfin je résume un peu, et qui refuse de reconnaître finalement aux Noirs ce que vous disiez tout à l'heure de leur rapport à la construction de l'Amérique, la question de l'esclavage, etc. Moi j'ai deux questions. La première, c'est d'où vient cette impossibilité? Et enfin j'en ai même trois. La deuxième, comment la dépasser? Et la troisième, si l'on y parvient un jour, est-ce que c'est ça la solution?
Le troisième.
Est-ce que si un jour l'Amérique arrive à dépasser ça, est-ce que c'est la solution? Est-ce que c'est là ça y est, on y est ou...
Well, it's difficult to answer because I'm American, so I'm speaking, about America. But just as I said earlier, I think many of the issues I'm talking about in terms of power are somewhat universal. They're manifested among Black people, and that's the way I know how to talk about it, specifically Black Americans. But I suspect we're talking about bigger themes here. So when one speaks of the dream in the American sense, it's important to note that I suspect the erection of dreams, the erection of national myths, is at the foundation of any country. America is, I suspect, not original in its establishment through violence. I suspect that any country with any history in this world, if you spent long enough time looking at it, you would find people underneath of its boot. So America is not particular in that. But again, being American, speaking from that perspective, what is, I think, a little different is America's messianic sense of itself. The idea that it is the Enlightenment Republic, it is separate from all the problems of the old world, of Europe, of Africa, and all these other places, that it is distant, that it is outside of history almost, that it uniquely is a force for good, not even just in world, but in human history, that it is the hero of its own particular story, and that there's never been anything like it. We call American exceptionalism is the term we use back home. Part and parcel to that myth, to that dream, is the idea that we've never done anything wrong. And if we've done something wrong, we did it by mistake. It's not really who we are. It's like, I bumped into you on the subway station. Yeah, I did bump, but it was a mistake. It was an honest mistake. Not like I saw you in the subway station and mugged you. It's not, we didn't do that. But in fact, all of the mistakes that, America sort of ascribes to itself are in fact not mistakes at all. They're things that made America possible. I don't, this is going to be difficult to translate into French, but I'll just go ahead and give my interpreters hell. In America, slavery, racism, white supremacy, all these things are not bumps on the road. They're the road itself. That's how it happened. And if you remove those things, you don't really have an America at all. There's just no American history. So asking, well, can America get past it? I mean, you have to imagine a different country. That America is not, it's not the America we live in now. The first thing, and I think this is the hardest part of it, in that America, there really are no white people. There are people, as I said before, with lighter skin, with straighter hair, or whatever physical attributes that you might, right now, at this very moment, attribute to white people. But that definition does not exist. Because in America, the definition only has meaning through the use of power. It's the only thing that gives it meaning at all. Separate from that, it just means nothing. It means nothing at all. And so that's difficult, because you're talking about a majority of people in a country, not a minority, a majority of people parting with their self-definition, and thus parting with all of the privileges that come with it. That is very, very hard to imagine. That's the future which we struggle toward. Can that day come? I just don't know. I just don't know. There are a lot of people who would tell you, yes, it has to come, blah, blah, blah. It's destined to come. But see, to me, that's also part of the dream. That's still the same thing. You know what I mean? That too is, part of it. I don't know. Did I get all three? I don't know if I got all three. Peut-être juste le
très bien.
premier.
Non,
okay,
tout va bien.
Merci.
Tout va bien et les traductrices ont très bien rendu l'image de la route et des bosses, donc tout va bien. Mais en même temps, tout va très mal. Et justement, quelqu'un me disait, pas seulement, un jeune étudiant aux États-Unis de Princeton et d'autres, vous reproche de ne donner absolument aucun espoir à la jeunesse, ni à quiconque d'ailleurs, et de dire, certes, qu'il faut avoir cette position de lutter. Vous avez trouvé votre moyen de lutter, qui est l'écriture, mais quelles autres armes sont à la portée aujourd'hui des Afro-Américains? Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas un risque justement d'en repasser par la violence, ou à partir du moment où c'est l'impasse, où c'est le no future, il y a quelque chose comme ça. Donc, quelle est votre responsabilité là-dedans?
Ma responsabilité. My responsibility is to look at the world, to observe it, and try to be as honest as possible about what I see. That's my responsibility as a writer. I think a lot of writers and other people in America feel some responsibility to write things that are inspiring, that to write things that make people feel hopeful. If I'm being uncharitable, I would say to construct fairy tales, about the future. I don't think that's love. More important than hope to me is love. Love is actually very, very important to me. And throughout my life, the people who loved me the most were often those who told me the harshest things. In fact, everyone who loved me the most today, I can't think of anybody, who didn't, who I have any sort of respect for. The truth is the truth, man. We're all gonna die. And me telling you, no, you're going to live forever, that's not love. It's the thing, a lot of people said to me, how can you talk to your son like this? How do you tell him these things, I said, you know what would be much worse? If I told him a myth, and then he went out into the world and got punched in the face. Because that's what happens to black kids who don't know. That's exactly what happens. Better, to prepare folks now. I just, I think that once you accept the limitations of the world, of what the world actually is, You know, I think raging against that is a beautiful thing. I think it has meaning. You know, listen, I am descended from a group of people who for 250 years fought against slavery. Now see, I said that relatively quick, which gets over the fact that 250 years is a long time. See, you could be born in the middle of those 250 years. You could look back and you could see your parents and you could see your great-grandparents, and all you could see is slaves. You could look forward and see your kids, and see your grandkids, and see your great-grandkids, and all you could see is slaves. And even if you looked past the slavery, all you could see after that was terrorism, was destruction, was lynching. That was all you saw. And yet people got up and they struggled. They struggled. Nonetheless, you know, I think, you know, if you say that, you know, struggle only means something if you're successful, it means that the slaves who struggled in their lifetime and died, and slavery was still there, that somehow their lives were failures. Now, people can construct a grand cosmic sense and say, well, you know, if you look at the long picture, at the 5 generations, in fact, they were successful, so that means, no, I don't buy that. Because the people who died in slavery did not get to see the end of it. And that is a tragedy that cannot be erased by your, you know, as far as I'm concerned, arrogant, you know, big picture view. You know, it matters. These are people whose bodies were taken from them. And that was their entire life. And you know, I won't succumb to the notion that these people are like bricks in my road. No, their lives were important. They didn't ask to be that. They didn't ask to die for me. They didn't ask to be enslaved and have to struggle against that for me. Something was taken that was never returned and can't in some profound sense be returned. That's tragic, you know? And so, I mean, you asked about my responsibility. My responsibility is not to lie to people. You know, my responsibility is not to look to young people and tell them, you know, it's all going to be okay because it all was. It was not okay. It wasn't. And so I don't know. I feel like I'm supposed